Hello and welcome to the Long Talk, the show where we talk with athletes, coaches, administrators and other people involved with the world of sport. We talk about their journey and where they are now. And today I have a different one. We're going to be talking analytics of sport. And joining me is Simon Strachan.
Yeah, very good, Paul. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me.
So Simon, you're with Gainline Analytics and you guys look at different teams and sports and analyze how they work.
Yeah, that's right. So generally sports analytics very much focuses on skill and outcome and output of teams and individuals. We've taken a completely different approach to the way teams work, and we look at the inputs, how the understanding between players on the field influences performance. But in doing that, we look at it from a very sort of overall perspective around governance. How does an organisation put their team together from an overall long-term structural standpoint, and then how does that influence performance on the pitch? So it's not about what a coach can do on the day. It actually stems back to how does the organisation set up the team in the long term? What do they do? What are their structures underneath, and how does that influence performance? So, the All Blacks, yes, they've got a lot of great players, but that's a function of the structure underneath for many years in that way. So that's the way we look at sport, and that's the way we analyse it. And we can analyse teams in different ways from that long-term perspective all the way down to individual games. And then by doing that, we can actually look at performance in context. Is a team overperforming, underperforming relative to where they should be? And how does that affect players? Sometimes players have bad games. Is it because of them, their individual skill, or is it a function of the way the team is working around them? So it's just a different view, another view of how teams function. But what we think is actually quite powerful view, and the fact that it's not necessarily looked at, because very much skill is the focus on performance is very much on skill. And that skill is not necessarily the biggest driver. When we talk about skill, it's not just the player skill; it's also the skill of the coach from that perspective as well. That around tactics, the difference at elite sport is actually very little between the skill of the players and the skill of the coach. It's not very often that you have an outlier. Someone who can change the game in that way. So, but from our perspective, the ideas around cohesion analytics, as we call it, has a long-term impact, and it is a long-term impact, and that's why it's not very tangible from a game-by-game perspective, and that's probably why not many other people have picked up on it. So, but it's actually, if you listen to a lot of interviews with Scott Robinson, he talks about the Crusaders. He quotes a bit of our work, and that's sort of a fundamental driver to the way that they've been successful for such a long time. So it's in there. It's in the fabric of every team's. So some teams just don't realise it, and other teams do. So we just put a language. We can put a language to that, and then some teams have embraced it, and other teams go on their merry way and try and buy talent and try and buy success.
So let's have a look at why you guys look at things differently and go back and have a look at your sporting background and how you got into sport and how you kind of think about it all. What was your first rugby memory?
Yeah, my first rugby memory. So I was actually born in the UK, and I actually came to Australia as a young kid. I actually moved to South Australia, which is not a rugby hotbed in any way. It's an AFL state, but I was very much an Anglophile as a kid, and I got it as growing up, because I supported the English cricket team, and I wore my Tottenham Hotspur jacket to school, and no one had a clue what was going on. So I always followed football, soccer, rugby league and rugby union, because I enjoyed that, and that sort of connected me with my English background. But really for me, from a football perspective or a soccer perspective, it was always the FA Cup, but then it was the rugby league Kangaroos tours of the UK, and then it was Grand Slam, the Wallabies Grand Slam tour, and then the 91 Rugby World Cup was the one that sort of captured me, and that's really sort of captured me as a rugby devotee. And then from that, I started playing rugby.
So how old were you when you moved over to Australia from England?
Yeah, so I was only young, so I was only sort of single digits.
So you remember getting up in the middle of the night and watching the games with your dad, sort of with a Milo?
Yeah. It was like, it was a bit of a family tradition, especially the FA Cup. Like, that was the thing. You know, people like Ozzy Ardiles and Ricky Villiers playing for Spurs back in the early 80s. Like, they're just so these memories I've got no idea what they look like, but I just know I have this memory stuck in my mind of that, and this romanticism of the sport, because you didn't necessarily get a lot on TV back in the day. And it was like rugby as well. Like, rugby on TV was such a rarity that it was just so exciting, especially like the Kangaroo Rugby League tours to the UK. It was just held up in this, you know, this amazing thing that you used to get up in the middle of the night to watch. And it was like that for the 91 Rugby World Cup as well.
So look, I've been to Melbourne, and literally every single preschool playground, never mind actual school, seems to have an AFL set of sticks in it. So so who did you play soccer with, or where did you find a soccer team to play with?
Yeah, it was literally, to be honest, it was me and my dog playing in the backyard with a stick and a soccer ball. It was hard. There was nothing. It was AFL. So it was cricket in the summer, which of course everyone did, and I did. And then it was AFL in the winter, and then there was me hanging out with all my mates, which was just me and my dog and the stick. So yeah, so the opportunity I got, earliest opportunity when I got to gravitate to other people with the other similar interests, and it helped for me. Eventually, when I moved to the city, then that gave me the opportunity to get to play sport at a higher level and get to play rugby at a higher level. Like, not a professional level or anything like that. I was just a very happy individual that actually got to play club rugby whenever I could. Like, I was never destined to play professional. I was never big enough. I was never fast enough from that perspective. But I was passionate, like every rugby person. You can't, if you're going to play rugby, you've got to be passionate, because if you're going to get whacked for 80 minutes, you've got to love the game.
Yeah, that's when I gave up rugby, was when everyone else got bigger and I didn't grow quite as quickly and got squashed all the time. So that's why I gave up. Looking at your career, though, but you started coaching early on at Adelaide University.
Yeah, so basically, early on in my playing career, I kind of sort of stand there on the field and said, I'm sure there's more to this game than what the coaching are telling me. So I actually did a coaching course very early on, just so how can I help myself with the game? How do I better understand what's going on with the dynamics? Because I've always been a very analytical person. I was like that at school. I ended up going into a profession that was like that, and I always wanted to know more. So I actually did a coaching course, and what that allowed me to do is, as I was playing, I also coached as well. So that gave me other sort of learnings around the sport, other aspects. So it could help me with my own game, but also I could understand what's going on as well. So, and part of that was I ended up coaching the team that I played for. I ended up coaching. I was injured for a season, and I ended up coaching the University of Adelaide women's team that was started by my wife, who was an American exchange student at the time. She rocked up to the club and said, I want to play. And they said, well, we don't have a women's team. So she came back the next day with 14 friends and said, well, you do now. And they said, oh, Simon, you're injured at the moment. Can you coach them? And then she went back to America and I followed. And so that was years ago, and 2 kids later. So through that, playing and coaching at the same time really gave me insights to the game and allowed me to sort of understand the game further. And I think one of the benefits, I honestly believe one of the benefits I had is not growing up in a traditional rugby state, that I didn't necessarily have any preconceived ideas around the game. I would break the game down into the fundamental areas of it, and then look at what part of the game was important and what wasn't, and then able to build the framework from that in my own mind. And so I think to a degree that actually gave me a little bit of advantage over people who potentially were involved in traditional rugby states that just assumed this was the way you did things. this was the way it happened in the game because that's the way it's always been done. And if anything, because I was coming in with ignorant bliss, I actually sometimes took a different approach and would actually look at the game in a different way. Sometimes I got it completely wrong, but other times I didn't. And through that, it allowed me to actually go from a coaching perspective down a reasonably unique pathway. And I actually got, when I eventually moved to Melbourne, involved in the Rebels junior pathways and coached with some junior representative teams to some reasonable success, which was partly due to my own, I suppose, own experience, some very, very good assistant coaches, and also just the nature of the way Victorian junior teams were put together as well, which comes back to that whole cohesion story that I'm involved in.
Are you jumping ahead a bit there? Because you're missing out a period of like a decade where you were drawing cars.
Yeah, and that's right. And that way it comes back to sort of the way my brain works. So I was always an analytical person, and I could also draw. So I ended up being a car designer for 10 years. So I worked for Holden. That's the reason I actually moved to Melbourne, because I got a job as a designer with Holden. So which was a fantastic. At the time when I was there, it was awesome. You know, designing SS Commodores and Monaros and all those sort of things. And it was a great time. They were a great company we worked for as well. But at the end of my time there, I for some reason, I started to lose the passion. I could also see that the car industry was not necessarily going in the direction that I could see it was going to be sustainable. And so I actually wanted to get out and move. Actually, I put together a plan B, and my plan B was to do a dip ed, to have basically a school teacher qualification as a plan B in case it went all pear-shaped. But coincidentally, an opportunity came up in a school in Melbourne to be director of rugby and to be a teacher as well. So I actually took the plunge. I said, car industry, not too good, opportunity to be a director of rugby at a school, which means I could shape the program at a school and also be a first 15 coach. And I'd been a first 15 coach at another school in Melbourne before that. And I really enjoyed it because you get the opportunity to work with kids and mould kids, and generally the school rugby is a good way to hone your skills. And so I took that plunge, left Holden, took up a role and worked at a school for 5 years as director of rugby. Damn near killed me because I was very...
hang on a second, just before we move on from the old car stuff, there's a lot of petrol heads who obviously enjoy rugby as well. No, I'm not one of them, but tell me, which was your favourite car that you got to design?
Well, you have to be involved in the new Monaro that was released in sort of 2001, 2002, more because of the history that went with that car. The fact that, like, it was such a fun car to be involved with from the design sense, because it was literally designed on the lounge room wall of the head of design. One day he just got some designing tape and taped it up in his lounge room, took some photos, and they actually built the prototype secretly and presented it at a motor show, and people were agog. They were just amazed. They had to talk North America into allowing them to turn it into a production car. And you would literally take these cars before someone could buy them. There would be cars on the road after the release, and you'd take them for a drive, and you'd stop at a service station and fill them up with petrol, and people would be literally just coming out of shops and coming out of their houses to look at the car, and to be involved in that and to see the passion of people around the brand and this particular car was, it was very uplifting to be involved in that particular brand and that particular car. So that was exciting. But then just the nature of the beast of General Motors and Holden, when Holden becomes successful, North America sort of got their tentacles in, and became a lot more corporate, and it was it was a lot harder to create those one-offs like we did with Monaro, and so it became a little bit more bureaucratic, and I lost a little bit more of my passion around that time. But then, and again, a lot of your audiences in New Zealand, I'm not too sure if they're aware, but Holden is officially, the brand's officially been shut down.
Oh yeah, we're aware. Yeah, they've stopped. Yeah, so they stopped making them in Australia quite a few years ago, and then
brand shut down. So that, I mean, it happened 11 years after I felt that it was going to. So eventually, I was right. It just took 11 years for it to happen.
Absolutely. Well, now we've lost all the Ford fans. we can get on to.
In saying that, I was a Ford fan before I got the job at Holden, so I've got a soft spot for both. So I was a massive Dick Johnson fan. So if anyone's a touring car fan from way back in the day, because there's a lot of Kiwis have been very successful in touring cars in Australia. So I was a massive Dick Johnson fan, but but working for Holden, you can't help but support Holdens after that. So.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. V8 Supercars is massive over here. So you didn't get around to taking your dip ed. You just went straight into schools as a rugby teacher.
Yeah. So instead. I did. So basically, I did a dip ed part time while I was at Holden, and then got the job at as director of rugby at the school, and then plus teaching art and design because of my background as a designer. So I was a first year teacher plus running the rugby program. It was very hard to learn to be a teacher and run the rugby program because I was a little bit more passionate about the rugby than about the teaching side. Even though I did enjoy the teaching and the art and design side. I got there, and literally the first 2 weeks, the parents' rugby group said, "We were promised a tour to New Zealand. We want a tour to New Zealand." It was like, okay. It was a great tour. North Island. A couple of years later, I went to the South Island. We had a great time. We got absolutely flogged. But this is a great thing about New Zealand schools. They are beautifully and welcoming. Thank you very much for coming to our school. It's great that you've come. You're not going to win, but it's great that you're here. It's beautiful. We welcome you, boys. You're not going to win, but it was a real great time. It was great for the boys, especially Melbourne boys. That they're passionate about their rugby, but to be immersed in New Zealand, is a great experience for them.
Oh, absolutely. And so also at your time while you were working at school, you were working with under-18s at the Victoria level as well. So hence you were getting known within the union.
Yep.
And then the opportunity came up to do some work with Melbourne Rebels as a video analyst.
Yeah. So it was a sort of a long, convoluted way. So through coaching, it's like if you put your hand up for enough crappy jobs, and when I say crappy jobs, that's a bit harsh. So I was putting my hand up to coach a Victorian school, seconds 15, to play a touring English school, and then you do your hard yards. You get the assistant coach's job of the Victorian schools to go to the national championships. You do pretty well in that way. You put your hand up enough for the other jobs, and then one day someone says, "Oh, by the way, the Wallabies are in town. They need someone to hold a camera for training." Okay, that's me. All right, what do I do? We'll go down there, meet them, and then just stand at training and film, and that's your job, just for a day. Yep, no worries, I'll do that. So, and that's when I met a fellow named Andrew Sullivan, who was the Wallabies analyst. If anyone knows Andrew Sullivan, probably know him by the name Digit. So it was when Robbie Deans was the Wallabies coach, and so Digit was Robbie Deans' analyst at the Crusaders, and when Robbie was assistant coach at the All Blacks. And so for this one Wallabies training, it was like, Simon, just hold the camera, film this, film that, no worries. What are you doing tomorrow? Or nothing. Can you come back tomorrow? Yeah, no worries. All right, hold the camera. Okay. What are you doing on Saturday night? I was going to come to the test. All right, come to the test, meet me at the ground. I'll give you your ticket. We'll go up in the stand, do this. After the test, come back under the stand. I'll teach you how to download the video. No worries. You beauty, thanks. That was great, Simon. What are you doing this time next year? Well, I'll just be around. Okay, so we're back in Melbourne. So when we're back in Melbourne, come and visit. And it was literally like that. So I did that for a couple of years for the Wallabies. And each time it was like, what's the next stage? Video, coding, download, clip it. What do the coaches want? So it was like learning each step. And at that point, the sort of 2 years on, and then Ben Darwin, who had moved to Melbourne because the Rebels.
Well, actually, let's take a step back then to that. Then, so you've got no video background, you've got no coding or sort of training analyst background before this. No. It's just purely
because
point the camera over there, please.
This was back in the day because Digit he came from an IT background. There was really nobody. This was back in the day when there was no official performance analyst. There was no Masters of Performance Analytics courses at university. the analyst in the club he was the forwards coach and the analyst. He was the S&C and the analyst, or he was a guy who could run computers and was the analyst. It was a media guy who could clip VHS tapes and was the analyst. It was not a unique position, so it was not very highly data driven, unlike now where every university has their own, master's degree in sports analytics, pumping out, 100 graduates a year for 3 jobs, so to speak. So it was very much it was a develop on the run type of position. So, and if you were smart enough, if you could operate and if you understood the language of rugby and you could work and you had good interrelationship skills with coaches and you could work with them, then it's a sort of role you could fulfill. And that's essentially what happened with me in that situation.
So you've so the coaches you've been under, obviously you worked with Robbie Deans there at the Wallabies.
Yep.
Well, you were there for 10 years. So after Deans,
yes,
there was Link,
and
then after Link, it was Checker as well. Or did you leave before he?
No, with Czech as well. So it worked, and it was with Robbie at the Wallabies, and then after Robbie left, Digit stayed on as performance analyst, so I would help him. So I did the Melbourne test and did a few other tests around Australia with them. And then when Czech came on, at the time when that happened, the head performance analyst for the Wallabies used to be one of the Rebels guys. And just because purely through relationship, I know how you work. Strawny, you know what you're doing. We've got a good relationship. Can you come and help us? So again, similar thing, Melbourne and other places to fill the gaps. Up until last year as well. So
I don't know if you can give, if you're allowed to, give us a little insight as to how, say, Deans versus Link versus Czech looked at analysts and analytics. Did they have different favourite numbers they wanted to see, or
no? So I can't really tell you from the Wallabies perspective, because from my role it was more sort of logistics. The logistics side, but in saying that, there's always a lot of information. There's a massive amount of information that is collected and prepared. How much they chose to use and look in their own time, I didn't know from that perspective.
I imagine there's too much, especially from a week to week level to try and follow it all. So, one of the questions I like to ask. My a couple of other coaches is, what's your favourite stat? Because it gives you an idea as to is the head coach more defence or attack orientated? What do they look at? So it would have been interesting to see.
In saying that, my experience with the Rebels in sort of going through that period of time, working with a number of different coaches, is that I did experience that in that different coaches had different methodologies around analysis. Some of the coaches were, go find me something, just go find me a nugget somewhere else. And other coaches were, I want this. Like, this is my vision for the way we want to play. So this is what I want. So it was like some of them, one head coach was, this is it. This is what I want. Another head coach was, go find me something. Go find something special, or go find me a little gold nugget out there. And potentially that was a reflection of the way they were thinking. One coach was potentially, let's explore and find out what we want to do. Another coach was, I really know the way I want to play in that way. So, so each coach uses it a different way. And in saying that, in my experience is that each coach is very different. Some coaches can't even turn on a computer, where other coaches I've experienced can reprogram computers. So Stephen Larkham, for example, he is very, very, was very tech savvy. And so he had a great ability to actually dig deep down, because he was tech savvy, he could really visualize things in his head, where other coaches would sometimes struggle with a chart, let alone a whole bunch of information. So.
Well, that's interesting. So the image you get of Czech is that he is a more of an emotional coach rather than sort of heavy tactics coach. So I could see how those two might not could clash in a coaching environment.
But that's often the external persona. What happens in the external, what happens in the internal. Because I know the analysis department of the Wallabies during that period, and they were very good. And so what was used internally and what the perception was externally, often are two different things.
Right. Okay.
In that perception.
So if you've heard folks that Czech basically gets good performances by shouting at half time, there's a bit more to it than that. Put bluntly. So you were there at the Rebels when they were founded in the first year. How is that when you're going into an organisation from absolute scratch and you're building it from ground up? Was that something you found exciting, trying to build something from nothing?
It was. So one of my roles was coding. So I think when I got there, they may have just signed Cipriani. I think he was signing number one, and it was like, okay, here's our 60 players we're looking at. Go clip these 10 players, and it might be from Shoot Shield in Sydney, it might be from Prem Rugby, or it might be from NPC. I actually loved clipping NPC because it was so much better to watch, just for the nature of the way they played.
So we're not talking here about the quality of the camera work or anything like that. You're talking about the style of rugby when you say.
Oh, just the style of rugby, because it was just better. It was just more, because you're there like literally for hours having to clip games, and it can be very laborious and extremely boring. But so if you're going to be doing that, you'd rather be watching NPC where props are throwing 30-meter passes, cutout passes, than Prem Rugby where it's mud, rolling maul, mud, rolling maul, mud. We're actually going, is that the player I'm supposed to be clipping? The one covered in mud? Is that the player? I'm not 100% sure. So it was exciting in the fact that you would clip. So we would clip, and we would write a bit of a report, X, Y, Z. This is what we thought about the particular player, and just write some a little bit about their particular skill set, whether or not a minion like me that had actually any input into their selection choice. Ultimately, I think for that first squad, it came down to availability, but it was exciting to see it all come together just from that perspective. But in hindsight, from where I am now and the position I am and the way we look at the governance of teams and how teams are brought together, and knowing what the drivers are for teams like, the Crusaders of the world and the Leinsters, and the Melbourne Storms and other teams like that, and understanding how the Rebels put their team together, it was always going to be a disaster. By the nature of the way they put it together. So you've got, I think, 11 former provincial captains in one team, so many internationals, so much experience, but it was an out-and-out disaster, and a continuation of that, but nobody knew. So I can say that. I can say that because that's the way we look at it as Gainline Analytics.
Yeah.
But no one knew that that's the way it was going to turn out, because no one actually had thought about how you put teams together and the influence of the way that was going to be put together, because it was everyone really focusing on skill from that perspective, and what the influence of all that external experience was going to bring.
Yep. So, but you've got that. So that's 2010, and I'm trying to. So if Warren Gatland was at Wales, he was there for 12 years, wasn't he? So he would have been there. I'm trying to think when he would have started. So he would have started around about 2008, I think. Now, when he picked his very first Welsh squad, he picked 14 players from one region, from one team, and one player from another. So clearly, there was an idea of that combinations matter when you're picking an international team. So, surely there was the concept that combinations matter was around back in even back then.
You say that and you think, well, surely, but 90% of professional, in a way, 90%, like, this is a very generalized, bold statement, 90% of professional sports teams do not think that way. Majority of them are focused on skill acquisition. What is this player doing and how does he do it? without the concept of how does that individual player impact the players around them? How did that player do that at that other club? Is that transferable? And if it is transferable, or when that player does come to this club, when they are put under pressure, will they fall back to the defensive system that they knew at that other club and run the wrong line, and the guy outside him will then not know what to do and create a massive gap in that way. That's why low cohesion teams let in lots and lots of points. They may score lots, but defensively they're really poor. Danny Cipriani in that first year for the Rebels would do some amazing things, but then the Rebels would let in lots of points. And I apologise to the Rebels for harking back to that, but then obviously that's something that I know a lot. But it's like the Sunwolves now. The Sunwolves in Super Rugby let in a lot of points, but they are from the outside, that they look okay because they score lots of points.
Yep.
But there's a function here is that most teams put their B team against them. Oh, we're playing the Sunwolves this way. We can actually rotate. And what that does is actually opened up all these wonderful gaps and opportunities for the Sunwolves to score extra points. If every team put their A team against the Sunwolves, it would be like the Reds did earlier in the season, 60 odd to 5 or whatever it was. And we've got the data to show, because we track when teams change, we understand how the change occurs. Mm-hmm. And when teams put their normal team up against the Sunwolves, the scores are a lot to not much. When teams make changes, and yes, you can see the changes, but we look at changes in a different way, because you can make a change and the team can get better. You can make a change and the team get a lot worse. Generally, we'll rest these players, like the Chiefs. I'm saying the Chiefs. I think the Chiefs, when they led up to the Sunwolves, actually had a couple of resting weeks.
Yep.
And then it creates opportunity, it creates gaps, creates defensive gaps, and then the Sunwolves look actually better than they are in that way. I've digressed a little bit.
That's absolutely fine. Have you come across the ACE? Online that's
rugby.
It's Will down in Wellington. I know his name, but I've forgotten what his. It's Rugby Numbers or something like that. Is his Twitter handle?
Yeah, Ace. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So you think that so what he does, for those that don't know, is that he gets the squads for each Super Rugby game, and then he compares the players and says this player puts looking at the stats, this player is worth X number of points, and he then compares all the players, and then he adds a factor, a home factor and a team factor as well to the end. So what do you think of his system? Is he along the right tracks, do you think?
Well, the question I ask for every predictive system is, what's its purpose? Is its purpose to predict games? If that's its purpose, then thumbs up. That's its job. It's like ELO rankings. If anyone that doesn't know what an ELO ranking is, it is a method of predicting outcomes based on, in the simplest terms, previous performance influences future performance. If you're doing really well, your ranking goes up. If you're doing poorly, your ranking goes down. If a good team loses against a bad team, that's even worse. So it's a way of ranking performance based on previous performance, future performance based on previous performance, which is all very well. If your job is to predict outcome, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But my question is then, how does the team use it? If you went to a coach and said, you're going okay, and the coach says, why? Well, you've won the last 5 games. And then the coach says, well, how does that help me and win the next 5? And your prediction says, well, I don't know. All I know is you're going okay. Then what extra purpose does it have in that way? And and that's the thing. I don't know enough about ACE, whether or not it offers that, whether or not you could go to a team and say, here's some factors that we see about your team that will improve performance with it. So,
well, to be fair to Will, it's something that he does as a hobby, and it's done for more for entertainment.
Yeah, and that's partly what because our virtual Super Rugby, what we're running at the moment, that's partly entertainment for us as well, because when Super Rugby finished, we were kind of twiddling our thumbs when Super Rugby paused. So that's why we're running virtual Super Rugby. And because our prediction is we use a much different way. We don't use previous performance, we use team lists. And so we're basically selecting our own team list using randomized injury and what we think based on how the teams previously selected. Like the Jaguars, when they travel overseas, they virtually pick a different, not a different 15, but they, make 6, 7, 8, 9 changes to their team, where say the Crusaders are very stable in that way. So we model out the team list. So it's very different to the way they do it. But what we do, the way we look at it is our prediction. We don't do prediction for prediction's sake. Our prediction is to test our modeling to say which team would have won, why would have they won, what are the drivers that will allow the team to understand what's creating performance and what's not, where are your weaknesses, where are your strength, how can you fix it in that way. And prediction is just one of the outcomes.
But as you say, since Super Rugby has been suspended, you've been doing a bit of entertainment stuff. So your virtual Super Rugby, I've not checked out, but who is topping the table? Is it the Crusaders by any chance?
It is the Crusaders, and then the Sharks. But in exciting news to Queensland Reds fans, they've just topped after the last round. They are topping the Australian conference.
Okay.
Yep, but they've got a bye this week. So they're just 1 point ahead of the Brumbies. So I think the Brumbies only need to get a bonus point. I think they might be ahead on for and against. That may not be true, actually. So if the Brumbies get a win, they're back up to the top of, but it's pretty tight. So we were, so last year with our normal prediction, just with our normal modelling, our modelled Super Rugby table was on an average, I think 1.6 positions out. So overall, compared to everyone else, so it's reasonably good. But what we use it for is to say to a club, say to a team when we work with teams.
Sure. But at the moment, so people can follow this on on your Facebook, on your website and Twitter account. Yep. And so the things you've been taking into account. So you've already mentioned that you model how the teams go about selection. So for example, Warren Gatland at the beginning of this season with the Chiefs was doing quite a lot of rotation so that his players were fresh towards the end of the season. So again, you'll have continued that style of selection. So you're taking style of selection into account. You're randomizing injuries in there as well. Now, is the randomizing injuries, is it the same per team, or do you say, okay, look, the Chiefs historically can never keep more than three props fit, therefore they have a heavier. Or is it the same for all the teams from an injury?
Yeah, it's the same for all the teams. Like that was because we wanted just to keep it going. You can end up creating an infinite level of intricacy into the model.
Oh yes.
And we didn't want to do that. So
it's even injuries across the board, but randomised. So some teams will be impacted more than others.
And in part of that, for example, so Angus Tawaval came back last week from injury, so he got hamstring, thigh, quad, can't remember. So he was injured for about 6 weeks early on in the season. So we monitored that. So all the injuries that happened in up to round 7, we noted down and had a rough estimate. So like Alan Alatoa for the Brumbies, he broke his arm in I think round 6, so he had about 6 weeks. So he's coming back for the Brumbies this week.
Right.
So they're coming back in. So the actual injuries, so we've monitored that over the course of the season, and then we just throw in we've got a little random injury generator, and that is based on a historical injury rate that we know in Super Rugby, but it's not to the level of club by club because that's just bordering on just too much work. And that's why at the end of the season, we're going to throw a caveat, we're going to throw a little bit of a thing out there, just basically saying the criteria behind it. So if there is any form of Trans-Tasman or Super Rugby, so people don't use what we've done as, you beauty, I'm going to use this for betting or anything like that, because it is our selection, and our selection, we're doing our best, but obviously we can't see into the minds of what all the provinces think.
Oh yeah, and this one we suggest up front. This is for entertainment. It's not for. It's not tipping. But so we've got selection as the team by team how they've been selecting generally. Random injuries plus obviously the ones we know about already. So if someone's out for the season, they were out for the season. Obviously you take home and away into account. Home advantage.
So we've got margins. You know, an Australian team travelling to South Africa has a different sort of home and away margin from a New Zealand team travelling to Australia and all that. So we've got that modelled, because when we do our work with clients, when we do our work with teams in Super Rugby, because we give them predictions for game outcomes, so they've got context to their performance. So then they know if, from our perspective, whether there's an expectation to win or lose the game, so they don't underreact or overreact to a performance. And so within that, we've modelled actually that home and away, because travelling to South Africa is different to travelling to New Zealand. Travelling to South America is different to travelling to Japan, which is why Super Rugby is unbelievable when it comes to the conference and the draw and how much influence that actually has on the result. Like, no team's ever won a final travelling back from South Africa. So that's why the finals are so important. If you can win in a final in South Africa, but you've got no chance of winning the next and second final if you're travelling back from the Republic. It's just too hard.
So it's important to make sure that your semi-final is a home semi-final at the very least.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you've taken that into account. Do you take into account if last week's been a rest week or not? So how fatigue is impacting the teams? No,
because again, that comes back for the current model. For the current model we're doing now, that comes down to the how much emphasis we wanted to put in it and how intricate we wanted to make it. But that's absolutely valid in what you're saying.
As well. Okay, so it's a fairly complex one, and it's not just taking the Crusaders have beaten the Jaguares every single time, and the average points margin is 20. Therefore, that's going to be our result. It's kind of what I'm pointing out here is that it's a pretty complex piece to put in there.
And the important thing, and this is the crux of what we do, the game result is almost what's driven that game result is the decisions that organisation made 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago when they started their recruiting process. And that's the real critical part that people don't necessarily understand. The reason the Crusaders are successful, it's not because they've got a great coach and they've got great players, is that the decisions that have been made through that organisation's history over time has created that environment to enable those players to be together for that long period of time, that they've come together, developed a level of understanding and normative behaviours that they can bring players in and they quickly adapt and understand what's going on, and they become the players they are. And it happened back here, and now you're getting results back there in that way. And that's the difference between the way we look at performance and generally most other people look at performance.
So I had an interview last week, by the time this comes out, I think, with Tony Lewis, who is the CEO of Tasman Rugby. Now, Tasman and Canterbury are the two provincial unions that feed up into the Crusaders, and they both have a Crusaders Academy in them. If you look at the Crusaders recruitment for 2020, only one of their new players came from a province outside of those two provinces.
Correct.
If you look at something like the Highlanders, you'll see that actually whilst Otago and Southland are under Highlanders, you'll see that probably 3/4 or so of their new recruits would have come from places like Auckland, Taranaki, Wellington, etc. So they've not been together as much. And this is part of the stuff you're talking about in this, that it takes 5 to 7 years to build a... So the flip side of that, though, is people talk about how South Africa turned around from losing by 50 points to New Zealand, and a year and a half later they go and win the Rugby World Cup. So was that 50 odd points loss an anomaly, or can things be turned around that quickly?
So the real critical thing with that Springbok side under Rassie Erasmus was that coming into the Rugby World Cup, all the squads of those top tier nations, South Africa had the highest percentage of players who played in the last 18 months who ended up playing together at the Rugby World Cup. So basically what Rassie did with that Springboks team, he basically what we call back-ended. He had a set of players 18 months ago that had spent a small amount of time together. And it's always, when you look at one game, one game does not make a trend, obviously, but losing by 50 points, makes that game stand out. But they were an underperforming team, they were a team that weren't performing too well. And then he basically kept a very stable environment up to the Rugby World Cup. And come Rugby World Cup, the Springboks had the most amount of players in that squad that had played together over that period of time. I think from the top tier nations, I think the Wallabies had the least amount of players that played 18 months ago through that period of time up until the Rugby World Cup. So they had a whole bunch of players over that period of time that never ended up playing with the Wallabies, where the Springboks had all those guys ended up over that course of time. Majority of them end up playing at the Rugby World Cup. So they had a lot of time together. So
it's saying something like, the squad size is 32 players. So you're saying that over that previous year and a half, Rassie used something around, say, 40 odd, whereas the Wallabies used something like 60 odd players in that same time period. Hence,
whether it's those numbers or not, but that's
the gist. Yeah.
And so I think it was basically, and again, I can't speak for Rassie, but it was like, oh my God, I've got 18 months. These are my players. This is what I've got. This is what I'm going to work with. And these are my players. I've got 18 months. I'm going to stick with these guys, and this is what's going to happen between now and then. Whether or not that was his thought process, that's what happened. The real positive thing about the Springboks come Rugby World Cup is that, because when we look at a team, we look at the overall cohesion of the team. We also look at the individual relationships on a team, and often it's the weakest link that doesn't. It's not the strength of the whole team. It's the weakest link is the decider. You're only as strong as your weakest link, so to speak. And that was the downfall of the All Blacks over the last 12, 18 months in their selection process. But the great thing about the Springboks, they were so consistent across all their links, is that they actually didn't have any weak links across their team. And so because of that, it enabled them that they defensively, they were quite strong and they could put pressure on over the course of the tournament, which they did in the final. Not letting England score early, which was England's strength. When England score early, they put the pressure on. But when the Springboks stopped that, like literally the final was decided in the first 15 minutes. And then it was keep the pressure on. And like statistically with England, when they not allowed to score, they normally let a couple of tries go later in the game because they're up against it. The pressure comes on and they fold a little bit.
So when you're talking about the All Blacks having a weak link, are we talking, and we don't really want to finger point, but are we talking about selections such as Scott Barrett at 6 and perhaps the inexperience of the back three? Are those the kind of
so inexperience is potentially inexperience is not the right word for it. So but they're two really good examples that as a very generalized statement, so over recent history, the difference between, say, the Wallabies and the All Blacks would be if a fullback went down, the Wallabies would select the next best athlete to fill the spot. If a All Blacks fullback went down, the All Blacks would select the next best fullback to fill the position because there's so many of them. And the nature of the way the New Zealand system works, it is a structure through NPC, through Super Rugby, and it points to the black jersey, and it's this natural system that creates these powerful All Black teams, and that's one of the reasons why the All Blacks are successful. It's not because New Zealand players are so much better than everyone else, or this mana that goes around with the All Blacks. It's this wonderful system that creates these strong teams. But what happened from our perspective, and what our data tells us, is that the All Blacks started selecting people out of position, and that created these weak links. So they weren't as effective in attack and they weren't as effective in defense. And so it basically opened up these opportunities for the opposition. And so often these teams we just sometimes describe as flat track bullies, where when the pressure is not on, they can score lots of points, but when the pressure comes back at them, they can collapse. And that's potentially the quarterfinal to the semi-final. And they were very extreme examples of that, I think, because I honestly expected come semi-final time against England the All Blacks forwards, you basically just get over the advantage line, get the shoulders through, get that little pop pass, allow the back line to do their thing. But England just didn't allow them to do, and then the pressure came on the other way.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. So you work with sports teams and also leagues as well, explaining to them or trying to help them on how they should structure and put their recruitment together to be successful on the pitch. Do you work and you also work with businesses to do a similar thing?
Yeah. So because what we do, because we work in the basically fundamental drivers behind teams, because we don't use performance data or we don't have an emphasis on skill. Effectively, the way we analyze a team, it could be a rugby team, a rugby league team, a cricket team, a football team, but it's the same as whether it's a corporate team, whether it's a team in financial services, whether it's any type of team, that we can measure it in the same way. And we compare that against the particular KPIs. The great thing about sport is it has very simple KPIs. Points for, points against, line breaks, tackles, all those sort of things. Corporate's a bit different. KPIs can be different. I mean, one of the KPIs is share price. That's a KPI for a corporate entity. But it allows us to actually, we can still measure and offer input around corporate entities, how they set up their groups in the same way as we do sports teams, around governance, around how long-term recruitment, retention, exiting individuals actually help their internal cohesion is the word we use, at the level of understanding, and how that influences decision-making from a long and short-term perspective in that way. So it has applications in sport. Sport's great. It's an enclosed environment. The dynamic is relatively simple. It's actually, I mean, it's quite complicated, but it's a bit simpler than corporate in that way. But it's just as applicable in sport and is in corporate as well.
So I guess probably the most famous example of this is, so basically a sports team could come to you and you could do a kind of Moneyball style hire and fire suggestion to them if they wanted to.
Yes and no. Like Moneyball was very much a thing of its time.
Okay.
Yeah. So Moneyball, because the problem with Moneyball is Moneyball has a connotation about skill. Because what Moneyball was let's look at this individual. What skill does this individual bring to the team? Where we look at, if someone comes to the team, how does that influence the collective output of the team in that way? So it is an analysis of a collective, and how does the individual influence that collective, and how is that individual going to influence how the rest of the group perform? So it is an analysis of some form. We just don't like the term Moneyball because it has that pure data influence around it, and it's in some cases Moneyball has got a bad name because some sports have gone down the pure Moneyball route and have gone absolutely disastrous. So we tend to call it soft analytics, as in it's very much got it enables a much more robust decision making framework, because a team can go, understand what you're saying, we're still going to go this way, but we know we're going to wear the consequences of it in that way.
I guess the way I see it was it's an analytical rather than it's an objective way of selecting a team rather than a subjective way of
there is a great quote in the movie Moneyball, which I have to say, which is still one of my favorite books, actually, Michael Lewis's Moneyball, with Billy Beane saying to his chief scout when he's talking about how he chooses players, and he basically says to him, "You don't know. You actually just don't know." He's basically telling him it's just a guess. It's a gut feel guess, because he doesn't really know how he actually chooses talent. And of course, what Billy Beane was trying to do is actually, put a metric to it.
And let's be honest, for sports like your baseballs and your baseball, cricket, it's much more of a one-on-one competition within a team, whereas your footballs, your AFLs, your rugby, your leagues are much more the dynamic of what the rest of the players are doing. It's much more team on team rather than so it's a different. There's definitely a difference, a reason why sort of a skill measure might work in that situation, because it is one-on-one rather than. Well, obviously there are other factors in there, but it's more one-on-one than the other types of sports.
Yeah, and that's true. And so the rugby codes, rugby union, rugby league, because we describe it as a 180-degree invasive sport. So you've got a line attacking a line, and so cohesion is the way we describe it. It manifests itself quite strongly in the rugby codes because of especially defensively, because ultimately it's not about the individual's ability to make a tackle. It's the space between the people in the defensive line, their ability to work that way. So in the 180-degree sports, cohesion is quite strong. In the 360 invasion sports like AFL, basketball, netball, hockey, football, it's there, but it manifests itself in a different way. But then in football, in soccer, it's a 360 sport, but then you've got the back four working in a 180-degree line. So it's got this other dynamic in there as well. But then we've actually done some work in T20 cricket as well to understand the influence of cohesion, how national teams and how clubs select their T20 team, and how the influence on there. And there is signals from a cohesion standpoint on ability of teams to bat first and bat second, and how they work under pressure, batting first and batting second, and there is a lot of evidence around from a cohesion standpoint that the more highly cohesive teams, whether that's the Perth Scorchers in the T20 or teams in the IPL, because of their selection criteria, have been more successful in that way as well. So not necessarily in Test cricket, because that's long and drawn out, but in T20, where every ball, and when I say long and drawn out, not in a bad way, of course, because Test cricket's fantastic, but in every ball in T20 cricket is important, and every ball has a piece of stress involved with it. And so there is a bit of influence in that as well. And it's about the collective working together, about knowing the bowler, knowing that he's got confidence to bowl in a certain spot because he's got confidence in the guys around him, and guys batting together.
Yep.
And those sort of things.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, he's right. It's not a pure one-on-one sport. But but even at Test cricket, that building pressure, and so hence when you've got Warne and McGrath bowling, building pressure at both ends, it's much more effective than just one end creating pressure and the other end letting off that pressure as well. So it is there. Wow, we're running out of time. Is there anything that I've missed that you'd like to let us sort of know about on game line analytics?
Yeah, no, well, so it's a really interesting time for professional sport at the moment. So we obviously we've been working in competitions like Super Rugby. We've worked in Prem Rugby and in Pro 14. But obviously everything's slowed down for us. So what we've actually done recently, we've opened up a webinar series on our Cohesion Analytics webinar series. So because we actually want to open up what we're doing to basically the rest of the world, other than just the elite teams. So to give people an insight into, and some of the things that we've talked about here, how governance affects long-term performance, and how structure and those sort of things that we can understand from building a club all the way down to some aspects of game by game perspective. So we've got a webinar series running, which is a function of the current climate that we're in, the fact that we can't be face to face much, but it's also about getting our message out. So if anyone wants to look into that, they can go to our website, www.gameline.biz. And other than that, follow all the things we talk about on our Twitter page, GL Analytics. We've always got something to say about what's going on. So I'm actually really interested with the current conversation around what's happening in New Zealand rugby. There are questions around NPC and the future of NPC and Super Rugby, and potentially what's going to happen, because like we talk about how the structure influences teams' performance, and the fact that the All Blacks is a function of the structure of New Zealand rugby. If that gets tinkered with, it might be interesting to see what's going to happen with the All Blacks over the years. So as an Australian, I'll be interested to see which way it goes.
And the answer, I'm afraid, is it's not going to be if, it's when. And you might, and as we've been saying here, you're not going to feel the effects of it for 5 to 7 years potentially.
And that's exactly right. So people that make the decision will probably not be in their spot when things potentially go south, and then the finger of blame will turn somewhere else. And we've just seen what's happened with that in Australian rugby. So
I was going to say, that sounds very much like what's happening in in Australia.
Yeah.
thank you very much for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you everyone for watching. Don't forget to like the Facebook page or subscribe on the podcast if you are listening rather than watching New Zealand Sports Radio. And we'll be back here at 2 p.m. every weekday with another long talk. So don't forget to listen in.